So what we should see now is the shared screen of the lives of the Eckersleys, who I've described as a prominent, quite prominent Wigan family. Over time, I've always wondered about these people and the buildings that they're involved in, and there's never seemingly been much documentation about it. So I could probably trace the original research back probably about 15 years. I haven't really touched it, to be blatantly honest with you, for probably like 10 years. But I thought it was overdue, and at the time that we're going through at the moment, I thought it would be beneficial to everybody to try and understand who these people were. Okay. So what we've got is not the greatest photograph or screenshot I took from Ancestry, but I'm going to try and go over the early Eckersleys as briefly as possible. Basically owing to the fact that we don't know a great deal about them from that time. I'd just like to make you aware that, you know, it really does start to begin from this section here, which my cursor's circling on a James Eckersley there from 1747. So what do we know about this Benjamin Eckersley? So we know he was born in 1690 in Carlton, which is in the parish of Dean, and he married a Wiganer on the 1st of November 1716 at St Mary the Virgin in Dean, and that was Anne Hilton. So looking at their children, or potentially more than the one child that I've listed myself. So we know this James married Mary Turton in 1741, producing 4 boys: Benjamin, George, James and William, one daughter, Mary. And we also know that this James was a yeoman and manufacturer, and his will made in 1773 leaves considerable sums of money to his younger children, giving the residue of his personal estate and all of his real estate to his eldest son, Benjamin. James died in 1783. So sorry about the extra star there, but I'm now up to speed. So his third son, James, married this Mary, described as a daughter of William and Jane Longworth of the Land, Heaton, near Horwich. So as I just previously said, this is pretty much where it begins. So here we see is Mr. James Eckersley. As we say, he's been born in 1747, married Mary Longworth of the Land, Heaton, near Horwich. Okay. So let's have a look at the short amount or small amount of information that we have on James Eckersley. So we know he was born 1747 in October, baptised on the 3rd of November in 1747 at All Saints in Hinley. The third son of James and Mary Eckersley, as we previously saw, and we know that he married this Mary Longworth once again at St Mary the Virgin, Dean in Lancashire, just like his father did as well. The marriage produced 3 sons, Nathaniel, 1779, who will go on to describe as having a highly esteemed military career. James was born in 1781, and William, birth unknown, but later on I do recognise the date of death, so any help once again would be good. And one daughter, Mary, as well. So we know he was a manufacturer and ran the business from Horwich. And in 1796, he decided to come to Wigan and stayed until 1810. He then moved to Laurel House, Hinley, and resided here up until his death in 1821. He was buried on the 29th of November of this year at All Saints, Hinley. So slightly moving on to again the first son, we're looking at this Nathaniel Eckersley, who I mentioned had a highly esteemed military career. He had such a military career that you're going to have to bear with me because of the sheer amount of text that I'm just going to have to read back. So we know these parents were this James and Mary Longworth of the Land, baptised at Horwich Chapel, 7th of Feb, 1779. He actually received his early education at law school, which I believe might be Warrington, possibly, and completed at Rivington Grammar. He actually enlisted as a private in 1795 and seemingly really rose through the ranks at a very, very quick rate, as we're going to see. So, as I've mentioned, he rises to the rank of adjutant of the 1st Regiment of Royal Dragoon Guards, rising to the rank of cornet and lieutenant. Now, this picture of Joseph Bonaparte will now become quite obvious. So, in 1809, Lieutenant Eckersley, with his regiment, joined the Duke of Wellington's army in the Peninsula and served in many of the glorious battles of the war, earning the special notice of his commander. Lieutenant Eckersley, amongst other trophies of war, brought home a pair of dueling pistols taken by 2 of his troopers after the Battle of Vittoria from the carriage of Joseph Bonaparte, the King of Spain. Now, at this point in time, I can't find any documentation of these dueling pistols, nor is there any listing at the Wigan Archives either. So we know in 1810 he was actually promoted to the rank of captain. So again, that's from 1795, in a 15-year spell, he's doing quite a lot militarily. So again, we mentioned Wellington. So in 1814, he's been appointed the Adjutant General of the Forces in Canada and present at Quebec in 1815, returning during the year to join the Duke's army on the continent. And on the 18th of June 1815, as we know, the Battle of Waterloo was fought in Belgium. Eckersley was actually quoted as deeming it as a misfortune in his life. He happened to be travelling at sea between military destinations. And so in 1815, he went with his regiment to Paris and did 3 years there. And 1 year later, he's an inspector of military stations with a brevet of rank of major, having received permission to accept the Russian Order of St. Anne, which was accompanied by an autograph letter from the Duke of Wellington. In the same year, he was decorated with the Guelphic Order and soon after with the Saxon Order of St. Henry. So after the Peterloo riots in Manchester in 1819, it was made a military station, and Captain Eckersley was actually appointed to the Brigade Major of the district. He remained there from 1819 to 1827, serving 8 years in Manchester. So, what's this interesting looking item? So this sword was presented to Mr. Eckersley on leaving Manchester. He was entertained at a public banquet and presented with a very handsome gold-mounted sword and snuff box, each bearing the following inscription: presented to Brigade Major Nathaniel Eckersley by a number of gentlemen, inhabitants of the town and district of Manchester, as a tribute of respect and esteem, and in grateful recollection of the important public services rendered by him during a residence of 8 years among them. And then furthermore, he actually goes to another part of the world in 1827, as he was appointed Deputy Quartermaster General of the Forces of the Windward and Leeward Islands in the West Indies, with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and the headquarters were in Barbados. So moving on, this picture might be quite recognisable to many. This is Laurel House in Hinley. So after just 6 years of service in the West Indies, Mr. Eckersley retired from active service and spent the remainder of his days at Laurel House in Hinley, a property that he inherited in 1810 from his auntie, who actually married his uncle George. And only 4 years back in civilian life, Eckersley passes away on the 12th of November 1837 and is buried, for anybody interested, at Hinley Church or All Saints. Dying a bachelor, he left Laurel House to his brother James, with its boundaries considerably enlarged. The property is now the inheritance of his great-nephew, James Carlton Eckersley, who will appear later on in this presentation. So, whilst putting this together, this is a bit of new information for me, and this is from a website from Clare Lynch in Australia. And just having a look at this, if you look in the top right, we can just see there's an interesting piece of land named Eckersley, and I'll explain that now. So in the early 1800s, a small township developed within the boundaries of what is now called Holsworthy Field Firing Range on the eastern side of the Georges River. The parish of Eckersley had been named in 1835 by the Surveyor General after Nathaniel Eckersley, He was a quartermaster general during the Peninsular War, which was part of the Napoleonic War. There was, however, no European settlement there until it was opened for selection under what was called the Crown Lands Act of 1884. Unfortunately, the remoteness of the area and the fact that the soil had proved not as suitable as first thought were contributing factors to the demise of Eckersley as an area. And some years later, when Lord Kitchener was visiting Australia on military matters, he declared Holsworthy as a site for a permanent army camp. The army took possession in 1913 and the rural settlement was abandoned. The settlers were paid absolutely no compensation. Moving on ever so slightly, so we have a younger brother to this military man, James Eckersley, born in 1781. This is a portrait of Mr. Eckersley done by Mercer or Mercier. Excuse me for my pronunciation there. So what do we know about this guy? We know he was baptised at Horwich Chapel in 1781. Actually educated for a short time at Rivington Grammar School, just like his brother. And on the 2nd of June, 1805, he married Elizabeth Ditchfield at All Saints, Wigan. The marriage produced 11 children. Her mother, Marjorie, hailed from the Banks family of Hallgate, known to be one of the oldest Wigan families of the time. So in 1814, he became a partner with his brother William, and in 1823, they actually began their spinning concerns in Walgate, known as James and William Eckersley. So it appears they've been in and around that area for quite some time, especially with the cotton interests. James served as mayor in 1833, and then 4 years later in 1837, he moved into Laurel House after the death of brother William in 1832. The firm was renamed James Eckersley and Sons. Unfortunately, James passed away in 1850 at Laurel House, and he's buried at Hinley All Saints. Moving on. So we look at the children. We mentioned there was 11. So we look at this James Eckersley. So if you continue to bear with me, like I say, things get a much more interesting in the following generation. So we know he was born on the 2nd of August 1809 and baptised on the 22nd at All Saints, Wigan. On the 1841 census, James is still at home with parents aged 30. And in 1851, he's actually living on Mains Terrace with 2 servants, number 125, occupation alderman and cotton manufacturer, which turns out he is partnered with his younger brother Nathaniel, who we're going to be coming up to now. I've had a look on the old maps for 125 Mains Terrace, and it appears before great changes in town, and especially the galleries and what have you was built, Mains Terrace isn't what you see today, which it actually leads to the multi-storey car park. It also went the other way as well in Old Wigan. So I think that's pretty much the location where the current market hall is today. So James was unmarried throughout his short life, which seems to be quite a popular thing going through the generations. And he was only 47, and once again another family member buried at All Saints in Hinley. And James at the time described as quite a shy, retiring person, and obviously died a bachelor as well. So moving on, this is where things start getting really informative. Probably one of the most famous Wiganers ever mentioned. So let's put that to the test. So here he is, Nathaniel Eckersley, born in 1815, or on the 13th of December 1815. He was living on Millgate. Now, Millgate around the time, and a little bit further on from that, was quite affluent. So if you was to live in and around one of the townhouses of the time there, you weren't doing too badly. He was also baptised just I don't know, 200 feet away or whatever, at Wigan All Saints. We know he was one of 11 children. We know the parents were James and Elizabeth Eckersley, who came from the Ditchfield family. And Nathaniel was actually educated quite early on by his grandfather, James Ditchfield. Nathaniel also spent some time at Wigan Grammar School before moving on to Birchall Academy in Warrington, where he completed his ongoing education. So continuing on, we know Nathaniel's father James and his uncle William formed a partnership in 1814 as cotton spinners named James and William Eckersley. The first spinning mill was actually built in the Walgate area close to the canal in 1821 and 22. Now, I would like to probably take a guess that the current location of Eckersleys is probably the pre-existing location as well. So in 1830, a 5-storey spinning mill was built in Poolstock, also close to the canal. Nathaniel actually entered the family business aged 17, following the death of his uncle William in 1832. His older brother James also joined, who at the time was aged 23, and they were both as partners. One of the mills previously built actually burnt down in 1880 and was rebuilt in 1884. The mill being finally demolished in 1960 for some of our older members who potentially might remember that. The company remained James Eckersley and Sons until at least 1886. So, where was Nathaniel Eckersley in 1841? So we know he's still on Millgate and he's living with his parents James and Elizabeth, and also older brother James. So as we see here, this is in All Saints. And as we see, Mr. Eckersley actually married a lady called Mary Fell, who hailed from Sharples near Bolton. This took place on the 21st of July, 1841. The wedding actually took place at St. Peter in Bolton. Their first son, unfortunately, would die in infancy, aged just 8 months. And further unfortunate would be that the marriage only lasted 7 years before Mary passed away in 1849 at Shelley House in Pemberton and buried at Hindley All Saints. This short marriage produced 3 children with 2 surviving daughters. This means Mr. Eckersley became a widower aged at just 33. Just a bit more information on Eckersley. So his father, as we know, died in 1850 and left the company to his sons James and Nathaniel. James was actually tasked with doing the trading, the wheeler dealing, the merchant side of things over in Manchester. And during this year of 1850, work began on improving the stock in Poolstock for housing, trying to encourage people to come to the area and work at Eckersleys. The Poolstock schools appeared in this year, both projects funded by the brothers and opened just 1 year later. And just at 6 years in dual ownership, we saw that brother James passed away in 1856, which actually meant Nathaniel would continue as sole proprietor. And 1851 is still in Shelley House in Pemberton. One of those questions that I do have, if anybody knows anything about this place, I don't. I would love to hear from you. So he's there with both surviving daughters from that marriage to Mary. And the occupations, Justice of the Peace for Lancashire, council member of Wigan Borough, cotton spinner and manufacturer. Just an interesting happening that seemed to take place just 1 year later. And this is taken from a book by Aspin, the First Industrial Society from 1969. And it mentions Mr. Eckersley's responsibility as mayor was to requisition and lead the military in times of riot. A serious colliers' riot in the Scholes area of the town in 1852 was not only successfully quelled but led to the adoption by Mr. Eckersley of his battle cry, Allons ma enfant, a loose Lancashire translation of which meant, "Come on, my lads." This motto was subsequently incorporated into a newly formed Eckersley coat of arms. And it's actually translated from the French, meaning "Let's go, my children." This picture predates the redevelopment of Wigan Parish Church, and this is from Wigan World. I think it might be one of Ron Hunt's specials, more than likely. So Nathaniel Eckersley actually remarried on the 8th of December 1852 at Wigan Parish Church, 5 days before his 37th birthday. Spouse Elizabeth Farrington, who was aged 25, was the first daughter of Henry and Elizabeth Farrington. And Elizabeth actually came from the Wigan family of woodcocks. And they produced 3 boys. We know the Farringtons were also long settled at Warden Hall in Leyland, which I think suffered a great fire. I think it was possibly the 1930s or 40s. And in 1860, Eckersley actually became a partner as a banker with the firm Thomas Woodcock, Sons and Eckersley. Moving on to the next census. So we see that Eckersley's not living in Wigan, and his family appear to be living at a place called Carlton Cottage, which turns out to be in a place called Yeadon, near Leeds. Once again, an open-ended question for you. If anybody could help and further research Carlton to see whether it's still there or not, that would be greatly appreciated. But what always fascinates me about looking at this census return is the fact that Mr. Eckersley's occupations took 2 full boxes to complete. So the occupations were banker, captain of the Lancashire Rifle Volunteer Corps, which we're going to talk about very soon, justice of the peace, cotton spinner and manufacturer. So we asked the question, who were the Lancashire Rifle Volunteers and why was Eckersley predominantly involved in this? So we know in 1859 there was a scare war with France that swept the country, and a lot of people started to become paranoid. And there was a raising of an unofficial army of sorts. So we had uniforms, equipment, drill halls, rifle ranges, instructors and weapons, all provided at private expense, and the volunteers being absolutely unpaid. There was 130,000 men who were under the rifle volunteer units, and from 1861 the smaller corps were absorbed by their larger neighbours to form administrative battalions. So there was a great turnout for a potential scare with France. So we know the Wigan Volunteer Force was actually formed in that year as well. And on the 1st of January 1860, Nathaniel Eckersley was appointed as captain of the 21st Lancashire Rifle Volunteers. And at last reading of October or November last year, this interesting piece of the Wigan Volunteer Rifles was on sale at coldstreammilitaryantiques.com for £550. And just as a footnote as well, while we're talking about the Wigan Volunteers, the brother-in-law of Mr. Eckersley was a Richard Atherton Farrington, and he was a lieutenant colonel for the Wigan Volunteers and later became an honorary colonel as well. He actually married his first cousin, Everilda Murray Woodcock, and the images that you can see to the right are from Wigan Parish Church. So what we can see there is Mr. Farrington's gift of the cross on the altar, and also what you can see, if I can just move my cursor around there, this is the screen area. He also donated that as well, and it's quite a poor rear shot there as well. Again, something else was going on in the world. So we've got the scare with France, and we've got some problems with the cotton famine stemming from America as well. And this is an interesting excerpt from Helen Brookwell, who describes how Eckersleys were dealing with such problems. You know, and you had usually about 9,100 people usually employed in the mills of Wigan. About 8,500 were made unemployed. But many had received relief as well, as other areas of employment such as coal mining suffered from the lack of demand from the cotton mills. So a temporary respite was felt at Christmas time when 13,000 eightpences were received from the Lord Mayor of London's Relief Committee. So what were these relief committees? So they were set up all over Lancashire to help feed and support unemployed mill workers and their families. Members collected and distributed charitable donations, and relief usually came in the form of tickets, which could be exchanged for food, clothing, and other goods. Now, during such famine, Nathaniel Eckersley went ahead and commissioned the building of St James's Church in Poolstock to be named after his father and brother. Church consecrated in September 1866. The total cost was actually paid entirely by Mr Eckersley, which was £15,000 at the time. And in 2020, that equates to £1.85 million. I suspect you won't be able to build that today for £1.8 million. Not a chance. And there's a question mark because there's something missing. And I just wonder whether the clock was an afterthought. As many people probably know today, St James's has a clock on all sides. I'm fairly certain, at least all sides anyway. So later on in the year, Eckersley would become the Conservative MP for Wigan, which was previously held by General Lindsay. But unfortunately, Mr Lindsay was serving in Canada and couldn't commit. John Lancaster was run-up in this limited vote as Eckersley finished up on 411 votes and Lancaster 349. Eckersley joined Henry Woods as the two serving MPs in Parliament. So, the candidates actually addressing the voters at the Moot Hall. Eckersley was offering himself as a free and independent candidate. As you can see, there's a bit of a Wikipedia special for the picture of the Moot Hall. And not long after, there was a reform bill in 1867, which increased the voting population of Wigan from just 900 to 5,000. And in 1868, Eckersley fell just short of Lancaster this time by 246 votes. Henry Woods maintained his seat in Parliament, now joined by another Liberal. Fourth place was Eckersley's colleague for the election and fellow Conservative John Pearson. And you don't have to be a mathematical genius to realise that this is more than 5,000 votes. So if anybody could clarify whether it meant a minimum of 5,000 or whether there was something else going on. But the votes were incredibly close, a little bit too close for my cynical mind. So just looking at the census of 1871, he's still at Carlton Cottage, just near Leeds. We've got 3 servants in residence, both daughters and 3 sons. Occupations of Mr Eckersley are magistrate, Mayor of Wigan, banker, farmer, cotton spinner and manufacturer. Interesting, this is Ryland's Mill, but I wouldn't want you to focus on that. If you look at the empty land in front, this was to become Mains Park, and as I'm going to explain. So in 1871, during the consideration of a Bill of Parliament, it was proposed that the town should purchase 16 acres of the Mains land for the purpose of a public park at a cost of £2,000, which is something like £237,000 in 2020 to acquire the land. Nathaniel, as Mayor of Wigan at the time, undertook to pay for the cost of the land out of his own funds. The council proceeded to secure possession and in due course secured the remainder of the land from a Mr Hodge. There was a grammar school to be built on the Mains adjacent to the site of the park containing 2 acres. And in that same year, Eckersley had to travel to London with the town clerk, William Maskell Peace, to actually complete the purchase of the manorial rights from the ecclesiastical authorities, which enabled Mains Park to be built. And also in this year, Eckersley opened the Conservative Club in the commercial yard. quite a recognisable picture. So in 1873, the long-awaited Royal Albert Edward Infirmary in Wigan Lane was completed. And as Mayor in Wigan that year, Nathaniel Eckersley was host to the Prince and Princess of Wales, who performed the official opening ceremony of the hospital. Now, where did they stay? They actually stayed at Hall in that year, and it's well known that Lindsay had spent an incredible or vast amounts of money to make it look as fit for royalty as he possibly could. And again, another Nathaniel Eckersley involvement. So in 1877, the famous, or what was to become the famous Market Hall was opened. Eckersley actually secured the site on behalf of the council of the time, amongst council members complaining that it was potentially a waste of money. So we know it continued for over 100 years to serve the townspeople before controversially being knocked down by the local council. And just some more Wigan World photographs to go on there as well. This aerial photograph is quite interesting, as we know. So on the 6th of August 1878, Mains Park was opened in Wigan by Nathaniel and described as a green lung for the people of Wigan. And also in the same year, Eckersley was appointed High Sheriff of Lancashire, and he was actually Deputy Lieutenant previous to that. And this was in recognition of his municipal policy and the great changes Wigan has seen in the past decade. I don't know what year this aerial view is, but I do have one question for people out there. Coming from Beach Hill, this is the path taking you up to the pavilion area, and it appears this path's disappeared, and this path's disappeared. I think it's a field now with goalposts on it. But furthermore than that, if anybody could tell me what this building was here, yeah, that would be greatly appreciated. Again, another aerial photograph, just going slightly north of the previous. Just in this area again, following the cursor, is a picture of the grammar school. And behind that, we've got what we latterly know as Jung Crew. And we have a mains field. I've been previously quarried as well. And this was actually laid out later on for the use of cricket and other sports for the grammar school as well. Eckersley's Market Hall is here, and we have the famous Market Square. And this section of land here, which forms part of the original Wigan Rectory, but now trimmed down massively, and now I believe is at sports offices for Phil Clark. But this now houses Wigan and Leigh College, which takes up quite a substantial amount of land, which meant these ornamental gardens would have been destroyed as well. And we still have these townhouses here, just running along, and quite interestingly, the Tudor House Hotel can also be seen as well. And this building would have been demolished to make way for the bus station some years later. So where is Eckersley in 1881? He's living at home with his wife, daughter Mary, and youngest sons Nathaniel, Farrington and Henry Francis. They were living at Standish Hall. Again, another Wigan World photograph. I'm sure many people have seen this one before. Just a bit of a stopgap before we continue with Mr. Eckersley. Just to focus on the youngest son, who actually passed away aged 23, as we can see here. The question is, what was he doing and how did he die? So let's have a quick look at Henry Francis Eckersley. So what was going on in around the time? The Third Anglo-Burmese War was taking place during November 1885, resulting in a nominal surrender of the Burmese army. Sporadic resistance continuing into 1887, and this just being a photograph belonging to the British Library, showing the Burmese army. So the Kyamadang Prince was forced to withdraw, but not without killing a British officer, Lieutenant Eckersley of the Somersetshire Regiment. British counterattacks forced the Prince to retreat to Yangon State, where he and his men fought for the last battle stoically to the last man standing. So unfortunately, a young Mr. Eckersley was involved and didn't quite make it through. So, sleep well, my boy. Mr. Eckersley was born on the 20th of April 1863, and we know his parents to be Nathaniel, obviously, and Elizabeth Eckersley. The youngest of the family, Henry's aspirations seems to have lied in the military, as previously seen by his great uncle as well. He was actually brought up in two different locations, so the Yorkshire area were Carlton cottages and Standish Hall as well. He was a lieutenant in Prince Albert's Somerset Regiment Light Infantry. This is known thanks to memorials in two churches laid by his family, and these read as follows. I won't read them back, but I'll just mention where they are. So you've got one at St James's Church in Poolstock, and you've also got one in St Oswald's in Guiseley, not too far from the area of Carlton. Now, a bit of recent research. I wonder where he was buried, and there doesn't seem to be much going on the internet. So some internet searches have yielded a little bit of information. So I found that there's been a British war cemetery at the Yartha Hills in Burma, containing the dead from the Third Anglo-Burmese War. I could not find other British cemeteries from the same war. In 2015, it was reported the cemetery had fallen into disrepair, with only 20 headstones remaining. Residents have been clearing the site to respect the fallen. Damage to the cemetery has been caused by local mining activity. If anybody could explain the use of having these stones on top of the headstones, would be greatly appreciated. I don't know if that's a religious symbol or whatever. Moving on, this is the Leyland Free Library and Museum at Hindley, or not anymore, if you like. So what do we know and how did it come about? So Mr. Hindley himself was known as John Leyland. He was Justice of the Peace and lived at the Grange in Hindley and died in 1883. So after providing his housekeeper and a kinsman, he left all the residue of his property to his good friend, Nathaniel Eckersley. Absolutely. Furniture from the Grange was used to furnish the museum, including a very elaborate bookcase, as you can just see there on your right-hand side. That came from the Grange. So in June 1887, Eckersley presented the Leyland Free Library and Museum and Leyland Park to the inhabitants of Hindley in memory of his good friend John Leyland. If I could just read this letter which Eckersley had sent to Mr. Pennington, who was currently serving chairman of the Hindley Local Board, and it's dated on March the 20th, 1887. My dear sir, the buildings erected by me in Hindley for a free library and museum are now approaching completion, and I am desirous to make the necessary arrangements for their opening and handing over to your board. I am informed that it will be necessary for your board to adopt the Libraries Act to enable them to maintain the buildings and make bylaws for their use. The reading room will be furnished and provided with a fair collection of books to commence with, and 2 tables which also will be provided for the billiard room. It is my intention for the present to give a sum of money annually for the purchase of new books and periodicals, and I hope eventually to provide a permanent income to meet the ordinary expenses, so that the library and museum may be little, if any, burden to the ratepayers in future. I shall be glad of your board's cooperation and hope they will take the necessary steps for the adoption of the Libraries Act. At the same time, I desire to hand over to your board the recreation grounds, which I have lately completed on the Grange estate in Hindley. The grounds are well drained and are provided with gymnastic apparatus, football posts, bowling green, and suitable ground for cricket or lawn tennis. Also, we have ornamental water, spacious walks, plantations, gatehouse and storeroom. I find your board have the power to acquire and maintain these grounds under the Public Health Act and to make bylaws for their uses. I intend to give a sum of money annually for the maintenance of these grounds and I am able to provide until I am able to provide a permanent fund for the purpose. I can only hope the proposed library and museum and recreation grounds will be appreciated and prove a lasting benefit to the inhabitants of Hinley. Believe me, my sir, to be yours faithfully, Nathaniel Eckersley. And we know that Pennington actually served for 20 years in the same role, and he died just a couple of months later on the 10th of July, 1887 at Hinley Lodge. So in 1891, we're still at Standish Hall, and he seems to have limited himself in his old age with his occupations, and he just essentially describes himself as a banker, which turns out to be with Parr's banking company. Also in residence is his wife Elizabeth, son James Carlton, and both daughters Mary and Elizabeth, if we recall, from his first marriage. So, after all that achievement and a full life, you're going to have to die at some point. So Eckersley actually passes away on February the 15th in 1892 at Standish Hall, age 76. His wife actually died just 3 years later. He was already confined to home with daily doctor's visits for around 6 weeks, suffering with dry senile gangrene in the right foot, which had unfortunately spread to other parts of the body. The family wished for a private funeral, but realised the popularity of Eckersley made it quite impractical. The Wigan Observer reports of the time say that blinds were lowered, businesses were suspended, flags at half-mast, and the bulk of locals lined the streets as the cortege passed, having begun at Standish Hall on its arrival to St Wilfrid's Church. So what do we know about the funeral cortege? We know there was an incredible amount of local or locally important people, and that there were 34 private carriages adjoining the cortege. So let's just see if you recognise any of these names. So we've got Woods, who's mayor at the time of Wigan, who decides to attend. The Reverend Henry Charles Bull, Mr Walter Mayhew, Mr Henry Woodcock, Mr William Maskell Peace, Mr Henry Darlington, Mr Francis Sharp Powell, MP for Wigan, Lord Crawford, the Hon and Reverend Canon Bridgman, Major Clifton Dickinson, J.B. Almond, Mr Hutton, the Reverend of Standish, the Reverend Canon Quirk, who was a nephew of Mr Eckersley, Mrs Banks of Winstanley Hall, Mr Richard Atherton Farrington, who was unable to attend due to illness, and as we learned previously, is his brother-in-law. And finally, the son of Mr Richard Atherton Farrington was Noel Farrington, and he could turn up. Right, so Eckersley actually left £97,000 at the time of death, and in 2020 it's something around £12.4 million. This is in memory of Nathaniel Eckersley, who died at Standish Hall, as we know, and this memorial can be found at St Wilfrid's Church. So, just leaving the surviving children, we've mentioned Henry Eckersley's exploits in Burma, so we're just going to have a look at the eldest son in James Carlton Eckersley and see what he was getting up to at the time. So what do we know? He was born in 1854 and registered in Pemberton, which is at the time, as we know, they was residing at Shelley House. In 1861, he's living at Carlton Cottage. In 1871, he still remains residing at Carlton Cottage. And we find, where are we? Sorry. he was educated, at Trinity College in Cambridge, and got a Bachelor of Arts in 1876 and a Master of Arts in 1879. Carlton Eckersley seemed to involve himself quite largely with the church and religion, much more than his previous family, it appears. So in and around the time that they were living at Carlton Cottage, James Carlton was doing good deeds. So we see that the laying of the foundation stone for the new parochial schools in Guiseley in 1874, and there was a procession starting from St Oswald's Church in the same place that took you up to the new schools. So we know also in 1882, Carlton Eckersley would be a county magistrate, but yeah, in 1891 he's back at home at Standish Hall, living with his parents. So his father dies a couple of years after this, as we've just seen. So James moves on to Ashfield House in Standish, and both sisters from his father's first marriage are also in residence. And in the same year, Carlton Eckersley was good enough to grant permission for a tablet to be erected at the Leyland Free Library in remembrance to the loyal North Lancashire Regiment who fought at the Boer War. And in 1908, Carlton Eckersley actually left Ashfield House to live at the Carlton Manor estate. Carlton actually got married, Mr. Carlton Eckersley, in 1910 to a Harriet Ellen Whitehouse of Uttoxeter, which becomes quite a mystery as we're going to go on with it. He was also a partner at the Eckersley Mills with his brother Farrington Eckersley, which we're going to move on to just after James Carlton. And he seemingly had, as I know, these church interests. So he was interested in St Nathaniel's at Platt Bridge, and other particular buildings like the Hindley and Abram Grammar School as well. So this is just showing quite an older photograph of St Nathaniel's at Platt Bridge, because I think the tower's been reduced for whatever reason, and the foundation stone is just at the front there for all to be seen. So what happened to Eckersley? He didn't have any children, we know that, albeit he got married. So he died in 1926 at North Audley Street in London, and this is my attempt at sort of trying to find it on Google Street View. He actually left £294,000 to his brother, Farrington Eckersley, which equates to £18.1 million, which leads me to ask another question to members watching tonight. Why it wasn't left to his wife. I don't know if there was some male ruling or whatever. I really don't know. I don't know enough about wills and probate to understand that. But if anyone else does, and could try and explain why it wasn't wholly left to the wife, I'd love to hear from you. So after he died in 1927, the Carlton Manor estate was put up for auction, and there was a bit of money left over, believe it or not. And this fund was created called the James Carlton Eckersley charity, based in Inley. And I'm led to believe from a older member of the Inley Historical Society who I met some years ago that the Tudor house in Inley was purchased from such money. So I had a quick look on the website to see if this trust fund and charity, after all this time, was still in existence. And all I could find was the objects of the charity from 1929, which just mentions the upkeep of the library, the Inley and Abram Grammar School, and Leyland Park as well. But there's a few on Companies House which seem to list some current standing Hindley councillors who were on the board there. So there's potentially still a fund for James Carlton Eckersley even after all this time. Just to have a look at what he looked like. Not the best photograph from his obituary in 1926. And this is James as a young man. He was actually a bell conductor at St James's Church in Poolstock, so he might have come from good stock, but he was certainly pushed in the right direction. And just to give you an impression of the bell tower, as you can see there, there's the ladders leading up to the roof. The photograph itself is around this area, but there seems to be other bits of plaques and stuff like that which have stood the test of time. It's almost a time capsule up there. It's really interesting stuff. So just finishing off briefly, I'm glad you've stuck with me up until now. It's been very difficult to try and limit the information and the text, and I've really struggled to do that. So I do appreciate you sticking with me. So Mr. Farrington Eckersley, we're just going to finish off with this gentleman. He was actually baptised at All Saints in Wigan in 1857, and just like his family, in and around the time we're living at Shelley House, and then also at Carlton Cottage as well. So he is actually listed in the Oxford alumni on the 2nd of December 1875, aged 18. So his brother was at Trinity at Cambridge, and this fellow's gone to Oxford as well. So interestingly enough, we move on in time just slightly to 1891. For whatever reason, is a visitor of a Mr. and Mrs. Harrison of Eastham at the Wirral. I can't quite explain his reasoning for being there at that time. And in 1893-94, he actually served Wigan as mayor. His father and grandfather had previously served. His father having a 4 consecutive year stint, which is, I think, is still a record. So just give you an idea of what this guy was involved in. You know, continuing with the manufacturing and the cotton mill routes and what have you. Right, so the original Swan Meadow complex were called Old Mill and Large Mill. Again, these were demolished, I think, in the 50s and the 60s respectively, and it now just represents a large car park. The development of the Western Mills by Farrington, as you can see here, number 1 Western Mill, excuse me, number 2 Western Mill, and number 3 Western Mill. Again, showing Claire's background at the moment. Not to read everything out all of the time, but they seem to put a lot of trust in Stott and Sons, who were architects based in Oldham, who have done plenty of work for the Eckersleys up until this point, and were also responsible for the building of these ring spinning mills. I don't know a great amount about textile manufacture, unfortunately, but apparently Farrington, you know, had a bit of foresight with this, hence the building of these mills. Just to show you one of the engine houses, which is the way it would have looked in engine house 2. So you see the flywheel and the engine at the forefront, and if you could just take note of the door just there, because in 2009 I managed to get in there. There's no roof on the engine house, the whole thing's collapsed, but just to give you some perspective, that's the same doorway from all the way back then. And again, back in 2009, I got myself a tour around Eckersleys. It's a lot worse condition than it was back then, but here you can see the rope race, you know, and quite elaborate tiling, this colouring, this pattern, this no expenses spared. And there's a younger version of me as well. Still doesn't know if I have a shave. And this sort of vista was taken by a friend of mine, which says it all for the Eckersleys. You've got the complex, and you've got, you know, the jewel in the crown, which was St James's Church at Poolstock, just to your left in the background as well. So Farrington Eckersley actually formed Eckersleys Limited in 1900, which was merging his own company with the surviving company from all those years ago. As I've just described, they held the original mills at Swan Meadow. Farrington isn't on the 1901 census. as he was serving as a captain in the Boer War, or the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, in the 3rd Battalion of the South Lancashire Regiment. And in 1903, just 2 years later, built by public subscription, the Boer War Memorial in Mains Park, Farrington attended the unveiling, as Mr. Francis Sharp Powell also addressed the crowd. And 5 years later, in 1908, he resigned his commission and was granted permission to retain his rank and wear the prescribed uniform as well. So in 1911, he moves yet again away from Wigan. He's living near Shrewsbury in a place called Wen, at the Trench, which I'm led to believe was a naughty boys' school up until recently. So he's living as a bachelor on his own, just with 5 servants as well. And in 1918, just 7 years later, Farrington sold up, probably First World War damage, not physical damage, but economic damage to the textile industry. Probably has something to do with that. But apparently, I'd like to know how much he got for that, but I think, as we'll later prove, he got quite a lot of money. He was appointed the High Sheriff of Shropshire in 1919. And he actually returned to Wigan 8 years later. So he came back to do a couple of interesting public deeds. And one of these is to essentially share or give a memorial case which James Carlton had gathered together, which contained basically ceremonial keys, trowels, whatever you like, at the laying of particular foundation stones for particular buildings. So yeah, that was at the Leyland Free Library. And 1 year later, he returned to Wigan and to Poolstock to open the Eckersley Gardens, which he was benefactor, continuing the kind doings of his family over the years. So, what was in the memorial case? So we've got 8 silver trowels on the opening of the new infant school of All Saints at Hindley in 1894, the Conservative Club in Hindley 1896, the Church of St John, Hindley Green 1898, the extension of the Hindley and Abram Grammar School 1902, St Nathaniel's Church, Plattbridge 1906, the further extension to Hindley and Abram Grammar School in 1909, and also St Nathaniel's Infants at Plattbridge 1915. And furthermore to this, there were 3 opening keys and an ornamental glazed frame containing 2 more opening keys from other buildings. Now, Eckersley Gardens, as I say, 1 year later, this is an actual photograph of Farrington Eckersley, stood beside the Mayor, Alderman, I think it might have been James Law, not to quote me on that. So this is Mr. Eckersley, and you see there was a memorial seat placed in the middle of the gardens, which you can see has been draped, and we're going to see the unveiling of that at the moment. We can see another picture, and Mr. Eckersley seems to be prodding his cane at the Mayor for whatever reason, or having a chat with him. As you can see, all the maces, the Ancient and Loyal, the Pride, everything else, all the Mayor's kit was out, if you like, swords, everything. A real ceremonial doing. So this is what it looked like. So we've got, again, Farrington stood by the Mayor, and we've got this memorial seat in the background, which was dedicated to his father, Mr. Nathaniel Eckersley. So, in building So in building these Eckersley Gardens, particular buildings had to make way as well. So it was actually necessary to demolish 7 cottages and a shop. And Wigan Corporation, previous to that, believe it or not, were looking for a solution to what they called Dangerous Corner at the junction of Pool Street and Poolstock Lane. And we learned that the reason for not having any gates on the Eckersley Gardens in Pool Street and Poolstock Lane was to prevent any liability of accidents from children running out of the gardens. So the gardens were laid and the paths were completed in non-slip stone. The unveiling of the seat by the Mayor and Mr. Eckersley was amongst a large procession of individuals from social, religious and public life. So Mr. Eckersley presents the deed of the gardens to the Mayor on behalf of the inhabitants of Wigan, and said he was pleased to hand the Mayor the conveyance of that property, with the hope that the Mayor and Corporation of the Borough of Wigan will preserve it as a garden and recreation ground for the people forever. Watch this space on that. Just to give you an idea of what the inscription said. So it's basically telling you of the achievements of his father, Nathaniel Eckersley, you know, and the fact that there was a gift from Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Farrington Eckersley. And there's also a quote, whether it came from Eckersley himself, I don't know. The quote is, "He that is greatest amongst you shall be your servant." So potentially there was an acknowledgement that he was a lot better off than other people and wished to serve in that respect. Right, this is a picture from the 40s, and I thank you for June McCoy. He was a member of the congregation at St James's Church. He was good enough to send me these, and this is the only picture I can find of what the memorial seat actually looked like. So you can see that Eckersley's bust is there, and also the inscription that we can see above. So we know both plaques have been removed or stolen, possibly during the 1960s. Another photograph from a member of the congregation, Mr. Jim Latham. This is a wedding from the 1980s, and just shows you the sort of remains, if you like, from 1927 of the original memorial seat. So we know the seat suffered with vandalism and lacked maintenance, and the local council decided to remove the remains, albeit rather ungracefully, judging by the first picture below. So as you can see there, doesn't seem to have been dismantled in any way, and I wouldn't put it down to vandalism. These stones were very, very heavy. You won't be pushing those around. And after a wild goose chase, I was tipped off by somebody who worked at Mains Park Depot and had been there for decades, and he remembered I'm having that in storage. And this is me finding them and trying to piece it back together again, which was very difficult. You can't move these stones on your own; it's just not practical. So that's pretty much where it stopped. There's also a couple of pieces missing as well. And as you can see here as well, we've got some mason's marks, basically used like a puzzle or a jigsaw to build the structure in a particular order. Just to show you the entrance, I think from Poole Street, and the circle there just shows the original foundation of the memorial seat dedicated to Nathaniel Eckersley. So what happened to Farrington? He actually passed away in 1935 at the Trench in Shropshire, and contents of the house were actually auctioned off a couple of months later. Not to read the whole will back to you, but please be aware that the blue font is applicable to Wigan and district. So, you know, he left quite a bit of money to the infirmary. And basically different buildings, books to the Corporation of Wigan, the Burmese idols and sacred writings and prints to the Leyland Free Library. I suspect that's something to do with his brother having served in Burma. £200 to Robert Barlow. Now, I think the Barlows were actually secretaries at Eckersley Mill for quite some time, and apparently did quite a good job. The Abbotson of St James's Church in Poolstock was left to his cousin, the Reverend Robert Quirk, which I believe, I'd like to stand corrected, the Abbotson pretty much meant that Quirk made the decision on who should be in charge. And also £10,000 to Henry Newell, who we know was his father's brother-in-law's son, who lived at Warden Hall in Leyland. Any residue of the property from the will went to a John Douglas Quirk and to the Reverend Robert Quirk as well, or the respective issue. The connection from the time actually exists from when Charles Quirk married Marjorie Eckersley at All Saints in 1835 at Wigan, which was on the auntie of Nathaniel Farrington Eckersley. Right, so how much money did he leave? Right, so left to the Westminster Bank, £575,000, £330, 14 shillings and 11 pence. And in 2020 equates to an incredible £41.1 million. And if we just look back at the will itself, you can see it doesn't, the will, the finances during the will doesn't get anywhere near that. So I think the residue of the property left to the Quirks, they've probably got quite a lot of money, notwithstanding the costs of death duties as well, which I've never been able to find out. So what happened to these Quirks who he left his money to? So John Douglas actually married Anina Oblianov, who I believe might have been Swiss, in 1923 and died in 39, and they produced no children. The Reverend Robert Quirk died in 1949 in Salisbury. And in 1949, he actually leaves £109,632 to his wife, Anna Diana, and only son Roger Nathaniel Quirk. So I suspect the Nathaniel has been used as such in memory of Nathaniel Farrington Eckersley. This amount of money basically equated to £3.9 million in 2020. So Roger married this Kate Webber in 1941, and they produced 3 daughters and no sons. The line would end with the daughters as Roger Nathaniel died in 1964. And a picture I've only recently come across on Ancestry as well is this photograph of the bachelor himself, Farrington Eckersley, pictured at the trench during the 1920s. He wouldn't have died much longer than this. Just another tablet, another memorial. This is to the guys from the Standard Shire who served in the Boer War, or the Second Boer War, and as you can see at the top of the page, we've got Captain Nathaniel Farrington Eckersley of the 3rd Battalion of the South Lancashire Regiment, and we see that Lance Sergeant Thomas Holton was mortally wounded, and Private Kennedy Ball died of burns at Howick. I mean, to die of burns at that sort of time must have been absolutely horrific. Right, just wheeling back a little bit, I mentioned that James Carlton was married to this to Mrs. Ellen Harriet Whitehouse. So where was Harriet after the death of her husband? She was living at a lodge at Carlton in 1934, so she seemed to have held on to some sort of property. She died 2 years later in Harrogate in 1936, and again I can't see any reference to the place called Kelderall. And the interment of Mrs. Eckersley was at Standish Parish Church, just like the rest of them, which I'm going to show you in 1 second. So how much money did she leave, and who did she leave it to? Seeing as she was pretty much the last Eckersley, albeit on the female side, this was left to the solicitors to deal with. It equated to something like £4.1 million. Not bad. And no children. Once again, there seems to be a common practice in the Eckersley family. Just to show you where they're buried, this is St Wilfrid's Church at Standish, resting place of Nathaniel Eckersley, his second wife Elizabeth, his first daughter Mary, second daughter Elizabeth, first and second sons James Carlton and Nathaniel Farrington, and also the wife of James Carlton, Harriet Ellen Eckersley. So the last Eckersley there is in 1936. And just take note of the paving stones as well. I managed to get a torch in between there, and it appears to be some steps going down into a bigger area. So it'd be interesting to know when the last time that was inspected. And just to finish off, really, just to leave you with some other memorials and stuff like that. So all these are based in the Church of St James, and I haven't really noticed the first daughters of Nathaniel Eckersley, which were Mary and Elizabeth. Again, unmarried, no children, and they lived on their own means. So as we can see in the bottom right, that Mary Eckersley died in 1900 And this is Elizabeth, the sister, who died in 1915, just 14 years later. Again, living on their own means. And quite a poor picture, just acknowledging the eldest son of the founder of St James's Church, James Carlton Eckersley. We made it. I've got a dry mouth. So I would never do something like that without truly appreciating other people, as humble as I am. So I'd just like to leave this screen up for others to acknowledge, you know, where the research came from and the people that I ended up meeting and who have been a great help to me. So thank you. I hope that made some sense. I've crammed a lot into that, and I'm trying to make it sound something like. So I hope it did, and I hope it's taught you something that you never previously did. Thank you very much.